Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on building a home. First of all, I'd like to welcome you to our Mortgage Lab webinar. The Mortgage Lab are mortgage advisors, sometimes called mortgage brokers, who specialise in home lending. We are paid by the banks to organise mortgage applications for them rather than their branch staff doing their work. This means we send the right mortgage to the right bank, which helps both the banks and the customers. Our job is to minimize the stress that surrounds a mortgage application process and to help the customer, you, get to where they need to be. If you'd like to talk to any of our advisors, simply go to www.mortgagelab.co.nz and click Contact Us. You can talk to any of our mortgage advisors listed there at no cost to you, or you can ask questions directly on our website through the chat icon. The goal of tonight's webinar is for you to come away with a clear understanding of the pros and cons of building a house, whether it's for you to live in or as an investment. You'll learn about the types of construction contract and the step-by-step process of purchasing a new build. And finally, we'll touch on how to estimate the unknown costs of building a house, such as the interest during the build stage. And then we'll look at how you might structure your mortgage once the construction is complete. First of all, let's talk about loan-to-value restrictions. For those of you who don't know, LVR stands for loan-to-value ratio. This essentially tells us what percentage of the house a mortgage has on it. Has a mortgage on it. So a house that is valued at $500,000 with a mortgage of $400,000 is said to have a LVR of 80% because the mortgage is 80% of the house value. At the moment, the banks have limits on what they can lend to customers. So as an extreme example, it wouldn't make sense for a bank to lend to 130% LVR. The mortgage would be more than the property was worth. So if you stopped paying your mortgage, the bank would have no hope of getting their money back. So at the moment, the magic number is 80%. A bank will happily lend to most people at 80% LVR. And as per the example just before, this would be a $400,000 mortgage against a $500,000 house. But the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has been trying to cool the investor market in New Zealand lately. So they have told the main banks that they can't lend over 65% LVR to investors and investment properties. This means for an investment property worth $500,000, you would only be able to borrow up to $325,000 and have to find the $175,000 from elsewhere. There is one exception to this: newly constructed properties. And here's where we get to the first real benefit of new build properties. Whereas a 20% deposit is the line that banks have no restrictions lending to you for your own home. And just a side note here, it is possible to get your own home with a 10% deposit, but there are severe restrictions on this. There are no restrictions on the banks for newly built houses. So this means for a turnkey contract, for example, a bank could lend up to 95% LVR. So let's look at what that means. So let's say Joe Bloggs here has a $50,000 deposit and is buying his own home. Using that money as a 20% deposit, he can buy up to $250,000 and borrow the remaining $200,000. Even if he could squeeze the banks to allow him to use it as a 10% deposit, he would be able to purchase a $500,000 home. But if he was looking at constructing his own home, he may be able to borrow up to, build up to $1 million home and borrow $950,000. So the most obvious thing that everyone says here is $1 million home. What if he doesn't want to buy that high? Now, we're not saying he has to. It may be that Joe's income doesn't support a $950,000 mortgage, but we no longer have to worry about his deposit holding him back. All we have to do is concentrate on getting him the mortgage that his income can afford. So if you're looking for more deposit, where are some places that you might find some more deposit, and what are some ways that you could increase your deposit? It's Very tempting to spend any bonuses you get from work. But remember, even a $2,000 bonus would allow you to purchase a house that is $40,000 more, with $2,000 being 5% of $40,000. You could trade in your car. Perhaps you have a car that's worth $25,000 and you could find a reasonably good car for $15,000. That $10,000 cash has increased your purchase ability by $200,000. And as a side tip here, if you're concerned about how much you can afford to borrow based on your income, it may be better to pay off any car finance rather than put this money into savings. Now, this is a case-by-case scenario, and I'd recommend you talk to one of our advisors before you do anything. The key here is to figure out what is holding you back from buying more house. Is it income or is it deposit? So if you can borrow $800,000, what is stopping you from borrowing 810 or 820? Is it income or is it deposit? And then work on a strategy to relieve that issue. Thirdly, Trade Me is a great way of getting rid of unnecessary items. We all have so much junk around the house. It may be a spare computer screen or clothes we don't use anymore. It might be a spare fridge in the garage that's never used. If you can sell all of this stuff online, how much more deposit could you have for that home? Next, you could get a casual job. Uber would be a great example of this. It's a job that won't interrupt your normal work, but allows you to save a little more towards your deposit. Again, if income is your hurdle, then Uber doesn't help. It's not regular work, so the bank can't use it to calculate your income. But if you need more deposit in a short amount of time, a casual job is worth investigating. If you need more income, a casual job won't help with this. Now, house sitting was one of the ways that we came up with in a couple of seminars that we've held, and the audience participation came up with house sitting. It's a great way to reduce one of your biggest expenses. Whether you're renting or currently owning, if you're able to move easily, then there are multiple websites with people looking for house sitters. Make sure you put the money you would have spent on rent into your deposit savings. And finally, a gift from parents or family is a common way that house buyers are increasing their deposit. I would estimate around 75% of my first home buyers have some sort of help from their family, particularly in Auckland. For investors, it's not quite that high, but still relatively common. One thing you may have heard of is the Homestart Grant. This is a government grant specifically for people buying their own home and typically a first home buyer. The money is a grant, not a loan, and the amount you receive is based on how long you have been contributing to KiwiSaver. If you've been contributing to KiwiSaver for the minimum required time of 3 years, you'll typically get a $3,000 grant. It's then $4,000 if you've been in 4 years and $5,000 for 5 years or more. These numbers are if you are buying an existing home, but those numbers double if you are buying a new home. And so just a side note here, a new home is defined as being bought directly from the developer and having been issued a code of compliance less than 6 months ago. So if you're buying a newly constructed home and you've been in KiwiSaver 3 years, you get $6,000 now rather than $3,000. And this continues up to the $10,000 you have if you've been in KiwiSaver for 5 years or more. If you're buying as a couple, that's a possible grant of $20,000 if you've both been in KiwiSaver for 5 years or more. Now, there are certain criteria that you have to meet, that have to be met to be eligible for the Homestart Grant. You can only purchase up to a maximum amount, and you can't earn more than a certain amount of income. I would encourage you to look at the Housing New Zealand site after this webinar to see these amounts. It's based, the maximum purchase amount is based on where you live in New Zealand. Okay, so let's look at the different types of construction contracts. There are 5 main categories that most newly built houses fall into. And the overwhelmingly majority of new builds are either progress payment or turnkey contracts. The difference is between progress payment and turnkey is the timing of the payments. With a progress payment, you purchase the section, usually from the developer, and as each of the major stages of building occurs, you pay a lump sum. So let's go back to our example of $500,000 purchase, and let's say that section was $200,000 and the cost of the build was $300,000. Let's say the client has a 10% deposit or $50,000. In the first instance, you would buy the section. So you'll use all of your deposit, $50,000, and borrow the remaining $150,000 from the bank. You'll have to use your money first, otherwise the bank will be lending 100% on the section. So you always put all of your deposit in first, borrow the remaining amount to buy the section. From here, the building costs will begin. So there'll be some clearly defined stages that you will need to pay a lump sum to the developer. Usually when the concrete slab is laid, when the framing is up, when the walls are on, etc. These will be all clearly defined in your contract, and the banks are quite used to this method. One thing to note here is that there is often a clause for additional costs. If the builders get to the section and find they need to do more groundworks, this may cost you. This can blow out the costs by tens of thousands of dollars, so be careful what your contract says about this. So that's how a progress payment contract works. As its title suggests, as the building progresses, you pay lump sums. So let's have a look at turnkey contracts now. Turnkey contracts typically start with paying a deposit, often 5%, 10%, and the remaining amount is due when the house is fully complete. They are a nice, tidy contract from the buyer's point of view, and there are a couple of things you need to be aware of. You might place your deposit on a house and have to wait for 18 months or longer until the house is complete. It's not possible to get a pre-approval from a bank that will stay in place for 18 months. Most only last 3 months. And so that means you are taking a risk at that your financial position will still be okay in 18 months' time. The way around this is to guess when your property is going to be ready and apply for a mortgage up to 6 months before that. If there are any problems with getting a mortgage, you have 6 months to find a solution, which might be to earn more money, increase your income, or try to on-sell the property. Because the contract is a true fixed price, the builder is taking on the interest costs throughout the project. As a side-by-side comparison, turnkeys are usually therefore slightly more expensive. This is just to cover their cost of interest and shouldn't be a reason to avoid them. And because these contracts are a true fixed price, banks are happy to lend up to 95% on the contracts. The same can't be said for the third contract in our list, self-managed contracts. This is a situation where a builder has a section and is going to source their own materials and build their own house. Typically, a bank will lend around 65%, sometimes 70, 75% for a project like this. This is often a source of frustration for builders who know they can build their own property for very cheap, but need more deposit as a result. The fact of the matter is that the bank has been burned many times before by builders allowing for absolutely minimal costs and then getting caught out. The risk from the bank's point of view is excessively high that builders will miss out on costs and get caught short. So they reduce the amount they will lend. Be aware that if you are managing your own build without a company guaranteeing the price, you'll need significantly more deposit than if a professional company was managing the project. And finally, we look at kit sets and relocatable homes in pretty much the same light. The advantage of these contracts is that they are both reasonably cheap to get a house onto land. In the case of kit set homes, the houses are built in a factory and trucked to the section. In the case of removable homes, they are existing homes that are moved onto the section. In both of these cases, the problem is that the company selling the house wants payment before it leaves their premises. Once the house is on the client's section, it's hard to get to repossess it if the client doesn't pay. The bank, however, doesn't see any value added to the section that they have until the house is on it. So they won't usually release the money until the house is placed on the section. So you can see the problem here. The client needs to have the funds available to get this house shipped to the section. But this needs to be available from their own pocket, not the bank's. And again, this is often the biggest source of frustration for some clients. The good news is there are several crafty ways around this. Using equity in your current home is one way to do it, or a temporary loan from family is another that covers you while the house is moved. If you're looking at one of these options, I suggest you talk to your lawyer and get in touch with us about presenting that to the bank. So what are the steps to purchasing? Well, not to blow our own trumpet, but the first thing you need to know is how much you can afford. So you need to get pre-approved to purchase. You can do that by going to our Mortgage Lab website, www.mortgagelab.co.nz, and clicking Contact Us. You'll see a list of advisors in your area, and you can choose from there who you want to work with. Give them a call and have a chat with them about what you're looking for. After a bit of a discussion, they'll book a meeting with you to discuss your needs and ask you to complete the first part of our online application form. You can find this application form by clicking on the yellow Get Started button at the top right-hand corner of our website. From this form, you're just giving the advisor the information he or she needs for your first meeting with them. This means that the first meeting can be much more focused on what you need and are looking for, rather than being held up by entering your personal details. And if you don't end up buying for a few months, there's no need to re-enter the data. You just log back into your profile and update everything. We essentially cut out the painful form filling process right at the beginning. But once you've got your pre-approval in hand from the bank, it's time to find a land and build property and do all the due diligence on the land and contract. You'll also want to run that contract by your solicitor and the bank to make sure it's all acceptable from their point of view. Something to bear in mind is that construction costs come with a couple of extra costs that buying an existing house sometimes don't. So the first one is almost all construction contracts require a registered valuation, which costs around $1,000. This is done in the beginning to confirm what the proposed house might be worth at the end of the build, and then that valuer comes back at the end of the project to confirm that the expected house is built and completed as per the plan. So if you've promised a 3-bedroom house, the valuer comes back and makes sure there is indeed a 3-bedroom house there. Secondly, as we've already discussed, with a progress payment contract, there are interest costs due throughout the project. You'll still be living elsewhere, I assume, with either mortgage expenses or rental expenses, so factor that into your budget. There'll be a time when you are paying both rental and mortgage expenses and the mortgage expenses for your new property. Here's a very rough formula for figuring out how much interest you're going to pay during the construction. Let's say the building company tells you the build time is going to take 1 year. My suggestion is that you extend that. It's almost always takes longer than expected because of holdups at, say, the council level. It's not a reflection on the building company at all. It's just that some things take longer than expected. Times it by 1.5. So if the company says a year, assume it's going to be 1.5 years. So you're going to hold that section for 1.5 years, but you're not going to have all the building costs over that time. In the beginning, there will be almost no building costs, and then as the project progresses, there will be more and more. So you take the interest costs for the build and you halve those. Now, before everyone gets too lost, let's look at a real example with real numbers. Here's a familiar example of $200,000 section and a $300,000 build. The interest rate of building is about 5%, and the company has told us it's going to be all done and delivered in 8 months' time. We know these things take longer, so we're allowing a year. The cost of holding a $2,000 section, I can see a mistake in my numbers there, it's $10,000, and the cost of paying interest on $300,000 build costs, half of that is $150,000. 5% of that is $7,500. If I'd got my numbers right, it would have said $17,500 there for a total interest costs. We might have this in savings, or we might just be able to pay for it in our income, or it might be available in our current properties. But we need this on top of the cost of the $500,000 build costs. Now, it might be less than this. It might be that they build it in 8 months, but we're trying to overestimate the costs rather than running out of money. Okay, so we're jumping forward in time now, and we've got our house. The house has a certificate of compliance issued, and the building company is just about to be paid its final payment. It's time to think about how you want to structure your mortgage. Up until now, it's likely the mortgage has just been one account that's been getting larger and larger as the build progresses. Or if it's a turnkey contract, you're just about to pay the final bulk, maybe 90% of the build. Before we look at how to structure your mortgage, it's important to understand the major types of accounts a bank offers. The 4 main types are fixed interest, revolving credit, floating account, and offset. Now let's look at a fixed interest rate first. That is a fixed rate account, the one you hear most often. When your neighbor says, I locked in 4.2% for 1 year at the bank, they're talking about a fixed interest rate account. The advantage of these accounts is that they're much cheaper than the other accounts. The disadvantage is that it's often expensive to make extra payments off that account. So you're essentially promising to pay the bank 4.2% for the next year, and that bank is making that promise to the people it borrows the money off. So if you pay extra off that, then the people who lent that money to the bank won't get the returns they expected. So they charge what is known as a break fee. In summary, a fixed interest rate account is cheaper, but more difficult to pay off quickly. The other 3, revolving credit, floating, and offset accounts, are all versions of the same floating interest rate account. The interest rate is a floating rate that moves up and down depending usually upon what the Reserve Bank of New Zealand sets. And that interest rate is usually about 1% higher than the cheapest fixed interest rate. The differences between the 3 accounts, the revolving credit, floating account, and offset account, are subtle, but you essentially boil down to a revolving credit can have money put in and taken out easily. It often has an EFTPOS card attached to it. The amount of interest charged is calculated daily. So if you put money into that account, you'll be saving interest on your mortgage from that night. The same goes for the floating account, but the money is not always as easy to withdraw again. So the clue is in the revolving credit, money goes in, money comes out. Floating, money goes in, but often you have to apply to get your money back out again. And finally, the offset account is part of your mortgage that is balanced against other accounts. So if you have a $50,000 offset account and you have 5 other savings accounts with $10,000 each in them, then you will pay no interest because you have $10,000 in savings accounts and a $50,000 offset account balanced against them. This type of account, the offset account, is really useful for people who like to keep their money separated. Maybe they have a holiday savings account plus a tax account plus a child education fund, and they use all those to keep the money separate, use it to reduce their mortgage at the same time. So now that we have our heads around the types of mortgage accounts, let's look at the most common structures of mortgage. Here we have 2 scenarios. You can see one on the left has the mortgage split between 2 fixed interest rates, and the one on the right has the mortgage split between 3 interest rates. The cost difference is around $30 per week. The most important thing to know about mortgages is that there is no right or wrong. There is only right for you. Most of my customers who are trying to pay the minimum amount would choose the mortgage on the left. Customers who are a little more worried about where interest rates are going would choose the option on the right. This option protects a third of their mortgage from any rate rise in the next 5 years. It means there is less risk of a big jump in payments in the next few years. Neither is more correct. You simply choose the one that allows you to sleep best at night. Now, you will have noticed that the total of the mortgage doesn't add up to $600,000. Don't worry, that's not a mistake. A usual mortgage scenario would involve a small amount on revolving credit. This allows extra payments to be put onto the mortgage and to pay your mortgage down quickly. All banks have this facility. It might be $10,000 that you set as a revolving credit, or it could be more. It depends on how much you plan to pay before the first fixed interest rate is due. So the real secret to revolving credit is knowing how to use it. A client who's focused on paying down their mortgage would have their money do something like this. You can see their income is coming directly into the revolving credit, and the bank will take the necessary payments out of the for the other two accounts. Whatever is left is temporarily reducing your mortgage. So let's say you have $4,000 left over after the suffix 1 and 2 payments. You're now only paying interest on the remaining $6,000 that is outstanding from the revolving credit. It's a great way to reduce the interest costs on your mortgage. Where a lot of people fall down with this technique is that they just spend all of their money and don't make additional payments. The key is to paying down your mortgage with this structure is to control how much you spend. And this can be done by transferring yourself a spending allowance. It means you know exactly how much you have, and the remainder will sit in the revolving credit account, reducing your mortgage. So the question now is, how can you find money to pay a little bit extra onto your mortgage? Well, the first thing to look at is your regular expenses. Is there something that is costing you a significant amount of money? It could be reduced. If you've got cable television, could you substitute it for a less expensive streaming TV solution? Are you paying too much for your utilities? They're painful, but open the door to those door knockers. Often you'll end up saving $1,000 or so on your electricity or power. The other strategy to figure out is to figure out how much you can earn, how you can earn more in a week, and maybe that involves driving for Uber or simply asking your boss for a raise. If it's casual work like Uber, make sure you don't increase your regular payments your regular mortgage payments at the bank. Otherwise, the work might dry up and you'll be stuck with higher payments. So with casual work, put the extra money into your revolving credit account, but maybe don't increase the fixed payments. Finally, make sure you plan your supermarket shop. At least one of the supermarkets that I know of has an app that you can order your groceries online. That way you're not tempted to buy random luxuries while you're strolling down the aisle. You can usually pick up the groceries for free and save yourself a delivery charge. Most importantly, don't remove good expenses like KiwiSaver and insurance. Most of these are costs that add to your financial position. They make you financially better off, so don't remove them. If you're not sure if you're paying too much for your insurance, get it reviewed by a professional insurance advisor. The Mortgage Lab doesn't give advice on insurance, but we work with a lot of high quality professionals who can help you. So get in touch with us and we'll point you in the right direction. Okay, to summarize, why construction? Building is easier to get finance, particularly if you have a lower deposit. A turnkey build contract needs as little as 5%, and this allows you to buy more house with your deposit. While you're waiting for the building to be constructed, the property could be growing in value. You could purchase a property at today's value and take possession in, say, 18 months with few or no payments. And this means you get 18 months of potential capital growth at almost no cost to you. Third, you receive double the amount of the Home Start grant if you meet the criteria, meaning even more money towards your deposit. Fourth, and also last, is as the bank is allowed to lend higher amounts against new buildings, it's a great way to build your investment portfolio. Rather than needing 35% for an investment property, you only need 20% deposit for a newly built investment property. Finally, thanks for coming along tonight. If you'd like to talk to anyone at the Mortgage Lab about getting pre-approved for the new build home, head along to our website at www.mortgagelab.co.nz and click Contact Us. You'll see all our advisors there and you can have a chat to them. Good night.